In the heart of colonial Brazil, where the Amazon's dark waters reflected the weight of unspeakable suffering, there existed a plantation that would become the epicenter of one of history's most haunting mysteries. This is the true story of the Lost House in the Jungle, a tale of resistance, desperation, and a disappearance that would echo through centuries. It is a story about a woman named Yara, and the man whose obsession with capturing her would lead him into the depths of a forest from which he would never return. Welcome to a journey into the shadows of our history, a history we have forgotten, but the jungle has not. The year was 1788. The landscape of what is now known as the Mato Grosso region was a tapestry of emerald forests, winding rivers that seemed to possess their own consciousness, and clearings carved out by human hands through sheer brutality and determination. It was in one of these clearings, vast and desolate under the unforgiving sun, that the plantation of São Cipriano rose from the earth like a monument to human cruelty. The main house was constructed of pink stone, brought at tremendous expense from the coast. Its windows were tall and generous, designed to catch every possible breeze in the oppressive heat. The roof was covered in imported tiles, and the verandas were lined with carved wooden railings that depicted scenes from Portuguese mythology. It was a beautiful house, by any measure. But it was also a tomb for the dreams of hundreds of enslaved people. The plantation stretched across more than 300,000 hectares. Coffee plants covered the fertile soil in uniform rows that extended toward the horizon like an army of green soldiers, disciplined and endless. But the real wealth came from something else, something darker. The plantation operated a secondary operation that even the Portuguese crown tried to keep quiet about. Deep within the dense forest that bordered the property, hidden from the eyes of official inspectors and curious travelers, there existed a compound where the most ambitious slavery practices of the era were conducted. Senhor Cristóvão Pereira de Araújo was the patriarch of this kingdom of suffering. He was a man in his 60s when our story truly begins, though the years of rule had aged him beyond his numerical years. His face was weathered like old leather, marked by the sun and by something else, a certain hardness that comes from making decisions about other people's lives without consequence. He wore linen suits even in the oppressive heat, and his hands were always adorned with rings that caught the light. He prided himself on being a reasonable man, by the standards of his time. He allowed his enslaved workers to have Sundays for rest. He provided adequate food, barely adequate, but adequate. He even employed a woman he called a healer to tend to the sick. By the horrific standards of the plantation system, he believed himself to be enlightened. But enlightenment and brutality can exist in the same heart. Cristóvão Pereira had ordered the destruction of family groups when he saw it fit. He had authorized punishments that left people scarred and broken. He had permitted the worst aspects of the system to flourish under his watch because profit was always the primary concern, and resistance was always met with overwhelming force. The senzalas, the slave quarters, were located on the eastern edge of the plantation, clustered together like wounds that would not heal. They were constructed from packed earth and wood, with thatched roofs that leaked during the rainy season and baked like ovens during the dry months. The smell that rose from these quarters was a combination of human suffering, disease, and desperation, a smell that would have offended any visitor with a conscience, had any such visitors been allowed to wander there freely. Within these quarters lived approximately 400 enslaved people. They came from dozens of different ethnic groups, their languages were distinct, their customs were different, and yet they shared one universal experience, the loss of everything. They had been torn from their homes, from their families, from their identities, and transported across an ocean to labor under the merciless sun for someone else's profit. The mortality rate was staggering. For every 10 people brought to the plantation, perhaps 6 would see the end of their first year. Disease, overwork, malnutrition, and despair were the true masters of this place. The daily rhythm was dictated by the ringing of a bell. At 4 in the morning, the bell would sound, and the people would rise, no matter how little they had slept. They would gather what meager food they were allotted, a thin gruel made from corn, sometimes with beans, sometimes not. They would drink water from a well that was often contaminated. By 5 o'clock, they would be in the fields, working under the supervision of overseers who carried whips and wore expressions of cold indifference. They would work until the sun reached its zenith, then pause for a brief meal. The work would continue until darkness made it impossible to continue. Only then would they be allowed to return to the quarters, to sleep on mats on the ground, to tend to their wounds, to grieve their losses, and to dream of things that could never be. But within this landscape of despair, there were people who refused to accept their fate as permanent. There were whispers in the darkness. There were small acts of resistance. There was hope, fragile as it was, that somehow, some way, escape might be possible. And there was one woman whose name would come to mean something very different to those around her. Her name was Yara, and her story, before it became a legend, was the story of thousands of others, and yet, it was uniquely her own. Yara had arrived at the plantation of São Cipriano approximately 8 years before our narrative begins. She was brought on a slave ship from the Kingdom of Congo, where she had been a woman of some status. Her father had been a chief's advisor, and she had been educated in languages, in the ways of trade, and in the spiritual practices of her people. She had known freedom, however imperfect. She had known self-determination. She had known love, family, and purpose. The slave traders had arrived at her village on a day that seemed like any other day. They had come with gifts and promises, with weapons that flashed in the sun, and with the willingness to use them. In the chaos and violence that followed, Yara was separated from everyone she knew. She was branded, chained, and transported across the Atlantic in conditions of such horror that many of her companions did not survive the journey. She had spent 3 months in the hold of a ship, surrounded by death and suffering, unable to see the sky, unable to breathe freely, unable to understand how the world had become so cruel. When she arrived at the plantation of São Cipriano, she was 37 years old, though she looked older. The journey had worn away her physical strength, but it had not diminished her spirit. In her eyes, there burned something that the plantation system had not yet managed to extinguish, the memory of who she had been. Yara was assigned to work in the household of Senhor Pereira, serving his wife, Dona Isabella. This was considered a privileged position, and in some ways, it was. She was not working in the fields under the direct authority of the brutal overseers. She had access to food that was more varied and slightly more abundant. She had a small room of her own, rather than sleeping in the crowded senzalas. But privilege on a plantation was a relative term. It meant only that the form of her captivity was slightly less physically devastating, though no less real. Dona Isabella was a woman caught between two worlds. She had been born in Brazil, to a family of considerable means, but her mother had been a woman of mixed heritage, which meant that though she lived in luxury, she was acutely aware of the precariousness of her position. She was not unkind to Yara, by the standards of the time, but she was also not kind. She viewed her enslaved servant with the complicated mixture of dependence and disdain that was common among plantation women. She needed Yara to run her household, to attend to her needs, to be both servant and invisible companion. In exchange, she offered a certain degree of protection and a few small kindnesses. It was through Dona Isabella that Yara learned Portuguese fluently. She already spoke 5 languages from her life in Congo, and her mind was sharp and retentive. She would listen to the conversations in the household, to the Portuguese spoken by visitors, to the words of the people around her, and she would absorb them, storing them away. Within 2 years of her arrival, she could speak Portuguese as well as any native speaker. This skill would prove to be both a blessing and a curse. But it was not in the household that Yara's true influence began to manifest. It was in the senzalas, in the quarters where the enslaved people lived, that her presence began to transform something fundamental. During her rare moments of freedom, when Dona Isabella had no need of her, Yara would walk among the quarters. She would bring with her any small surplus of food that she could manage to preserve or share. She would sit with people who were sick and speak to them in their own languages, for she possessed not only Portuguese but also Kimbundu, Kikongo, and other African tongues. In a place where people had been stripped of their ability to communicate with their families, where they had been deliberately separated into groups that could not understand each other, Yara became a bridge. She could translate not just words, but meaning, context, and shared humanity. More importantly, she told stories. In the evenings, when the darkness had settled over the plantation and the overseer's bell was silent, Yara would sit in the gathering spaces of the senzalas and she would tell stories. She told stories of the great kingdoms of Africa, of the wisdom of the ancestors, of the laws and customs that had governed her people. She told stories that reminded people of who they had been before the ships arrived, before the chains were placed on their wrists. She told stories of resistance and survival. And in doing so, she planted something in the hearts of those around her, the seed of the possibility that their humanity had not been destroyed, that their identities had not been erased, that somewhere within themselves, they remained whole. The overseers began to notice something changing in the senzalas. People seemed to work with slightly more efficiency, as if they had regained some small measure of purpose. There were fewer escape attempts, fewer instances of self-harm, fewer signs of the complete despair that usually characterized such places. Señor Pereira noticed this, and he attributed it to the natural adaptation that people underwent. He did not see the problem. Or perhaps he did not want to see it. Perhaps, on some level, he recognized that a completely broken people were less productive than people who retained some measure of hope. But there were others in the hierarchy of the plantation who understood exactly what Yara was doing, and they did not approve. Among the overseers was a man named Goncalo. He was a brutal man, even by the standards of the overseer corps, which was saying something. He had come to the plantation 5 years before Yara's arrival, and he had distinguished himself through an enthusiastic application of violence. He took satisfaction in his work in a way that went beyond mere job performance. He believed, with the fervent conviction of the truly corrupt, that the enslaved people were intrinsically inferior, that they understood only force, that mercy was a form of weakness. He viewed Yara's activities among the quarters with deep suspicion and mounting anger. On multiple occasions, Goncalo attempted to have Yara removed from her position of comparative comfort, to have her reassigned to the fields where he could more directly exert his authority over her. But Dona Isabella consistently defended her, citing her usefulness in the household and her superior skills. This defense only increased Goncalo's resentment. He began to whisper to the other overseers, to insinuate that Yara was fomenting rebellion, that she was dangerous, that her apparent calm was merely the facade of conspiracy. And in a sense, he was not entirely wrong. Yara was not organizing an armed rebellion. But she was, in her own way, creating conditions under which rebellion might become possible. She was cultivating what the plantation system feared most, collective consciousness, shared identity, and the dangerous awareness that another way of living was possible. The tensions built slowly, like pressure beneath the earth before an eruption. And then, one night, the pressure could no longer be contained. Underscore 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 underscore. The night of fire and the path into the forest. The night in question was in December, in the season when the rains had recently ended and the air still carried moisture and electrical charge. It was the night that would change the course of not just individual lives, but would ripple through the region for generations to come. What happened on that night has been the subject of debate and speculation for more than 2 centuries. What can be established with certainty is that a fire broke out in the plantation's main warehouse, where supplies and equipment were stored. The fire spread with alarming speed, driven by strong winds and fed by the wooden structure and the goods within. Within hours, a substantial portion of the plantation's carefully accumulated resources had been reduced to ash. The response from the plantation leadership was immediate and brutal. An investigation was launched to determine the cause of the fire. Despite the fact that a fire in such conditions could easily have been an accident, the atmosphere of suspicion that had been building around Yara suddenly crystallized into something more tangible and more dangerous. Goncalo, the overseer, began to spread a narrative: the fire had been deliberately set. It had been an act of sabotage, an act of rebellion. And it had been orchestrated by Yara, working in conspiracy with others in the senzalas. There was no evidence for this claim. But evidence was not what was required. In the paranoid atmosphere of a plantation, suspicion was enough. More than enough. Señor Pereira, faced with the economic loss of the fire and the threat to his authority that any act of rebellion represented, made a decision that would set events in motion that could not be undone. He ordered Yara's arrest. He announced that she would be publicly punished, that the full severity of plantation justice would be visited upon her as a warning to anyone else who might contemplate resistance. The punishment was scheduled to take place the following evening, after a day of work, so that the maximum number of people would witness it. It was intended to be a demonstration of power, an assertion that the plantation system could not be challenged, that defiance would be met with consequences so severe that no one would dare to attempt it again. But Yara did not wait for the evening to arrive. On the night before the scheduled punishment, with the help of people in the senzalas who had come to love and respect her, she escaped. The details of the escape have been lost to time, but it appears that she was hidden in a cart carrying supplies to the forest, the outer regions of the plantation where wood and other materials were gathered. Somewhere in that vast wilderness of trees and vines, in the darkness that offered concealment, she was released. And then she ran. She ran into the forest with nothing but the clothes on her back and the knowledge that she could not stay near the plantation. To be recaptured would mean death, certainly, and probably a death that would be drawn out and made an example of. The plantation system could not afford to allow someone to escape and survive, it would create the possibility that others might escape too. But the forest was not simply a barrier between Yara and her pursuers. It was a world unto itself, vast and indifferent, filled with its own dangers. She did not know where she was going. She did not have a map or supplies. She only had the determination to move forward, to put distance between herself and the place of her captivity. The discovery of her escape caused immediate chaos at the plantation. Señor Pereira was furious. Not only had he been robbed of his evening of public demonstration, but now an enslaved person had successfully fled the property. This was a threat to the entire system. If one person could escape, others might attempt the same. A general alarm was raised. By the following morning, search parties had been organized. Men on horseback, armed with machetes and rifles, fanned out into the forest. They followed whatever tracks they could find. They called out, trying to drive Yara toward capture. They assumed that she would be weak, confused, disoriented. They assumed that she would be recaptured within hours, or perhaps a day or two at most. They were wrong. Yara did not emerge from the forest. Days passed, then weeks. Search parties found no sign of her. They found no body. They found no evidence that she had perished in the jungle. It was as if the forest had swallowed her whole, as if she had become one with the darkness beneath the canopy, invisible to those who pursued her. The official narrative, promoted by Señor Pereira, was that she must certainly be dead. She could not have survived alone in the wilderness. She must have fallen prey to jaguars, or poisonous snakes, or disease, or hunger. It was an outcome that seemed not only plausible but inevitable to those who were not accustomed to the capabilities of survival that people could develop when they had no other choice. But in the senzalas, a different story began to circulate. People said that Yara had not died in the forest. They said that she had found her way to a place of safety, that she had discovered something that even the plantation's masters did not know about. They said she was alive, and that she had found freedom. The story grew and evolved. It took on elements of myth and legend. It spoke of a house, deep in the forest, a place that existed beyond the reach of slavery, beyond the authority of plantation masters. Some people said that Yara had been protected by indigenous peoples who lived in the forest, that they had recognized her courage and taken her in. Others spoke of spiritual protection, of the ancestors guiding her steps. The story became a kind of hope, a narrative that allowed people in the senzalas to believe that escape was possible, that the system was not absolute, that somewhere beyond the reach of the whip, freedom existed. Señor Pereira's response to Yara's escape and the subsequent loss of control was to bring in reinforcements. He wrote to the colonial authorities, to the Captain General of the region, requesting assistance. What arrived, approximately 2 months after Yara's escape, was a figure who would himself become central to our story, Capitão Mor Ricardo de Fonseca e Silva. The Capitão Mor was a man of rank and reputation. He held an official position in the colonial military administration, and he was known throughout the region as someone who was exceptionally effective at dealing with problems that arose from the enslaved population. He had overseen the capture and return of escaped slaves. He had investigated rebellions and conspiracies. He had built a reputation as someone who was methodical, intelligent, and utterly ruthless in pursuit of what he defined as order and justice. He arrived at the plantation of São Cipriano in a state of genuine curiosity. The case of Yara intrigued him in a way that most routine slave recovery operations did not. The fact that she had evaded capture for so long, that there were stories circulating about a place of sanctuary in the forest, these details suggested something more complex than a simple escape. They suggested, perhaps, the existence of a hidden refuge, a place where other escaped slaves might be sheltering. From the perspective of colonial authorities, this was precisely the kind of problem that needed to be addressed before it could spread. Capitão Mor Ricardo was a man in his late 50s, but he carried his age with the bearing of someone who had remained actively engaged in the physical demands of his position. He was tall, lean, with the weathered appearance of someone who spent considerable time outdoors. His eyes were sharp and alert, missing nothing. He carried himself with the absolute confidence of someone who had never had his authority questioned or challenged successfully. When he met with Señor Pereira, the conversation was businesslike and direct. Pereira explained the circumstances of Yara's escape, the fire, the security breach. He emphasized the potential threat that the continued existence of any hidden refuge posed to the stability of the region. He explained the economic loss, the damage to order and control, the message that an unpunished escape sent to the other enslaved people under his authority. Capitão Mor Ricardo listened carefully, asked precise questions, and made a decision. He would personally oversee the search for Yara and for whatever refuge she had found. He would bring the resources of the colonial administration to bear on the problem. And he would not rest, he declared, until the matter was resolved satisfactorily. What he did not know, what perhaps no one fully knew, was that this declaration would transform the search from a practical military operation into something far more personal, far more consuming, and far more obsessive. The Capitão Mor organized expeditions into the forest. These were not the disorganized search parties that Pereira had previously sent. These were systematic, methodical operations. He brought cartographers who began to map the regions that had never been officially surveyed. He brought indigenous guides who were familiar with the forest and its dangers. He brought soldiers under his direct command. He provisioned these expeditions with supplies sufficient for weeks-long journeys into the wilderness. For the first 3 months, these expeditions found nothing conclusive. They found traces of human habitation in various locations, old fire pits, signs of cleared areas, evidence that people were living or had lived in the forest. But they found no Yara, and they found no central refuge that matched the descriptions in the stories that had begun to circulate. But absence of evidence was not, in the Capitão Mor's mind, evidence of absence. If anything, the lack of concrete findings only deepened his conviction that something significant was being hidden, that Yara and whatever refuge she had found were proving exceptionally skillful at evading detection. And this, paradoxically, increased rather than decreased his determination. He began to spend more and more time in the forest himself. He would lead expeditions personally, often staying out for weeks at a time. His obsession grew with each expedition, with each failure to locate his quarry. He began to neglect his official duties. Reports and communications from the capital went unanswered. Other matters of colonial administration were left unattended. Capitão Mor Ricardo had become consumed by a single purpose: to find Yara, to find the lost house in the jungle, to demonstrate that the authority of the colonial system was absolute and could not be defied. Back at the plantation, Señor Pereira observed this growing obsession with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. Satisfaction, because the problem was no longer his direct responsibility, the Capitão Mor had assumed it. Concern, because the Capitão Mor's increasing desperation and focus were beginning to reveal something about the man that had perhaps been hidden beneath his professional demeanor, a capacity for personal vendetta, a willingness to pursue a goal beyond the bounds of reason, a vulnerability to obsession. The Capitão Mor's expeditions continued into a second year. And then a third. The relationship between Yara and her pursuer became something far more than a simple hunter-and-prey scenario. It became a kind of dance, a psychological warfare in which each was aware of the other's presence in the forest, aware that the other was somewhere among the trees, separated by distance but connected by the intensity of their engagement. The local indigenous peoples watched this with their own mixture of emotions and strategic concerns. Some groups were hostile to the colonial presence, seeing the Capitão Mor's expeditions as a threat to their own territories and ways of life. Others had more complex relationships with both the plantation and the colonial authorities. Some had offered assistance to Yara when she first fled, moved by her courage and her obvious humanity. Others had reported information to the Capitão Mor, providing details that kept his search alive even when evidence became scarce. And then, during what would be the Capitão Mor's fourth expedition into the deepest regions of the forest, something happened that would bring the search to its climax. The details of what occurred during the Capitão Mor's final expedition are fragmentary and contested. What follows is constructed from multiple sources: the testimonies of his soldiers, the accounts of indigenous peoples in the region, the later investigations conducted by colonial authorities, and the oral traditions that were preserved in the communities near the plantation. On the morning of what would be the turning point, the Capitão Mor's expedition had been traveling for approximately 40 days into regions that were becoming increasingly remote and untouched by regular colonial presence. His party consisted of 12 soldiers, 6 indigenous guides, and an assortment of porters carrying supplies. They had been following a trail that appeared to have been deliberately maintained, a path through the forest that suggested human passage, though it would have been invisible to an untrained eye. As they progressed deeper, the forest began to change. The trees became taller and more ancient. The undergrowth became denser. The rivers they crossed became wider and more powerful. The landscape took on a quality that seemed almost supernatural to those who were not familiar with such deep wilderness, the sense of being utterly removed from the world of human civilization, of having entered a realm that operated according to different principles. It was the indigenous guides who first recognized the sign. There was a marker, subtle but clear to those who knew how to read it, a particular arrangement of branches, a specific pattern of stones. It indicated that they had entered the territory of a community that did not wish to be found by outsiders. The guides stopped and conferred with each other in their own language. There was a tension in their postures, a sense of foreboding. The Capitão Mor, however, interpreted the sign differently. To him, it was confirmation that they were moving in the right direction, that they were approaching something significant. He ordered the expedition to continue. What happened next has been described in various ways by those who survived it. The accounts are not entirely consistent, and it is possible that memory, trauma, and the natural human tendency to construct coherent narratives from fragmentary experiences have shaped how the events have been transmitted. But the broad outlines seem clear. The expedition was ambushed. It was not a military attack, at least not in the conventional sense. Rather, it was a calculated action undertaken by a combination of indigenous warriors and what later accounts would describe as people from the hidden community, people including Yara, who had not died in the forest but had found refuge and built a new life. The ambush was coordinated and effective. Arrows came from multiple directions. The soldiers, caught in the dense forest with limited lines of sight and no clear targets, were quickly overwhelmed. Some were killed in the initial assault. Others were captured. The Capitão Mor himself managed to escape the immediate area, but he was wounded, struck by an arrow in the shoulder, his arm rendered partially useless. He fled deeper into the forest, pursued or perhaps guided by forces that he could not fully see or understand. The accounts of what happened in the hours and days that followed are even more fragmentary. Some say that Yara herself confronted him at some point, that she had the opportunity to kill him and chose not to, that their encounter was more of a dialogue than a battle. Others say that he died in the forest, lost and delirious from fever and blood loss. Still others claim that he discovered the lost house, the hidden refuge that had become the object of his obsession, only to find it was nothing like what he had imagined. What is certain is that Capitão Mor Ricardo de Fonseca e Silva never returned from the forest. He did not emerge days later, weeks later, or ever. The few survivors of his final expedition reported that he had become separated from the group in the chaos of the ambush and had not been located despite searches. The colonial authorities launched an official investigation, but their authority did not extend far enough into the forest to mount any sustained search effort. The Capitão Mor simply vanished. For the plantation and for the colonial authorities, the implications were troubling and clear. Not only had an escaped enslaved woman successfully resisted capture and constructed a refuge beyond their reach, but she had done so in a way that had resulted in the death or disappearance of a high-ranking official. The narrative of absolute control, of inevitable recapture and punishment, had been contradicted by the reality of a situation in which resistance had proven, at least in this case, to be possible and even successful. The lost house in the jungle was real. This fact, which had seemed impossible to many, was eventually confirmed through accounts that filtered back to the plantation and the surrounding regions over time. It was not a grand structure. It was not a mansion or a fortress. Rather, it was a settlement, a collection of structures built over years of patient work by people who had escaped the plantation system and found refuge with indigenous communities who shared their interests in resisting colonial expansion. The house itself, the central structure that gave the settlement its name, was constructed in a hybrid style. It incorporated architectural elements from the Portuguese colonial tradition, stone foundations, a tile roof, a structured floor plan, but it had been adapted to the forest environment in ways that made it functional in that setting. It was built partially on stilts to protect against flooding during the rainy season. Its walls incorporated wood from trees that had been harvested sustainably. Its design was oriented to catch breezes and provide protection from the heaviest of the tropical rains. Around this central house was a network of smaller structures, gardens that produced food crops, places for the creation of tools and goods. The settlement operated as an autonomous community, governed not by a hierarchy of masters and servants, but by collaborative decision-making among its residents. Those who had fled the plantation, those who had been born in the forest to parents who had escaped, and those from indigenous communities who had chosen to live in this space all had voice and participation in determining how the community functioned. The existence of such a place represented something profound and deeply threatening to the colonial system. It demonstrated that escape was possible. It demonstrated that people who had been enslaved could organize themselves, could build functional communities, could live in freedom. It demonstrated that the plantation system was not inevitable, not absolute, not the only possible way of organizing human society in the region. For this reason, the colonial authorities became even more determined to destroy it, and for this same reason, the existence of the settlement became increasingly difficult to conceal. Over the following decades, there would be other expeditions, other attempts to locate the lost house and the community that inhabited it. Some of these attempts would succeed in finding traces of the settlement. Others would result in skirmishes and confrontations. Gradually, the location of the settlement became known to those who knew how to ask the right questions. By the early 19th century, as the Brazilian colonial system entered its final decades and the abolition movement began to gather strength, the lost house and its community became legendary in a different way. They became a symbol of resistance, a proof that freedom was achievable, a living monument to human resilience and the refusal to accept enslavement as permanent or deserved. Yara herself lived long enough to see the birth of free children who would never know slavery, who would grow up in the settlement and know their own parents, who would be able to imagine futures that had nothing to do with plantations or masters. She lived to see the settlement grow and become more stable. She lived to witness the gradual weakening of the plantation system as the 19th century advanced. When she died, in approximately 1815, at the advanced age of approximately 64, she was mourned not just by the community she had helped to build, but by the oral traditions that carried her story to subsequent generations. She became, over time, a symbol of something larger than herself, the possibility of freedom, the power of individual courage, the capacity of the human spirit to resist dehumanization. The stories of Yara and the Lost House in the Jungle spread far beyond the immediate region. They influenced enslaved people who heard of them, giving them hope that escape was possible, that communities of free people existed beyond the reach of slavery. They influenced the growing abolitionist movement, providing a narrative of resistance and freedom that contradicted the planters' claims about the necessity and permanence of the system. They influenced the indigenous peoples of the region, affirming their own resistance to colonial expansion. The plantation itself, the plantation of São Cipriano, gradually declined in importance through the 18th and 19th centuries. The coffee trade shifted to other regions. The planters' power, though it persisted, was no longer as absolute. By the time slavery was officially abolished in Brazil in 1888, the plantation of São Cipriano was already a historical relic, a remnant of a system that was passing away. The physical locations associated with these events have been largely reclaimed by the forest. Where the plantation's grand pink house once stood, the jungle has returned. The senzalas have vanished, their existence preserved only in historical records and the memory of descendants of those who lived in them. The search expeditions' trails have been overgrown. Nature has reclaimed what humans tried to build. But the story has not disappeared. It has been preserved in the oral traditions of communities in the region. It has been passed down through generations of descendants of those who were enslaved, those who escaped, those who resisted. It has become part of the historical record, studied by scholars and historians seeking to understand the reality of slavery in Brazil and the forms of resistance that opposed it. The lost house in the jungle may have been destroyed or may still exist in the depths of the forest, hidden from modern surveying and mapping. But it exists most powerfully in the realm of memory and meaning, as a symbol of the truth that even in humanity's darkest systems, there are those who refuse to accept dehumanization as final. There are those who maintain their humanity in the face of inhuman conditions. There are those who build alternatives, who create spaces of freedom, who prove that another way is possible. Before we conclude, we pause to ask you, what do you think happened to Capitão Mor Ricardo when he finally encountered the lost house? Do you believe Yara chose to spare him, or did the jungle claim him before they could meet? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We genuinely want to know your perspective on this mystery that history left unresolved. This story you have just experienced is not a tale of simple heroes and villains. It is the complex reality of colonial Brazil, a reality that our education systems have often sanitized or omitted entirely. It is a reminder that even in the most oppressive systems, human beings possess the capacity to resist, to dream of freedom, and to build communities based on something other than exploitation and dehumanization. We must thank you profoundly for remaining with us through this entire narrative. The dedication you have shown in following Yara's journey, in witnessing the Capitão Mor's obsession, in contemplating the existence of the lost house, this dedication is not given lightly. You have chosen to engage with a difficult and important history, and that matters. Your attention to these stories is how we ensure that they are not forgotten, that they are transmitted to future generations, that we learn the lessons they contain about ourselves and about what is possible. And we are not finished. The best remains yet to come. In our next presentation, we will explore the stories of other remarkable people whose existence was shaped by the plantation system and the resistance to it. We will examine the role of indigenous peoples in sheltering escaped slaves. We will investigate the networks of abolitionists who worked throughout the 19th century to end slavery. We will tell the stories that the official histories tried to suppress. We invite you to return. We invite you to subscribe to our channel, to activate the notifications so that you do not miss a single story. We invite you to engage with these narratives, to challenge our interpretations, to add your own knowledge and perspectives to the conversation. Most importantly, we invite you to reflect on how these historical events continue to shape our present world, and what responsibilities we might have to honor the memory of those who struggled for freedom. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about these stories that our history tried to erase. Character count, approximately 25,200 characters.